Under the harsh glow of the fluorescent lights in the crew lounge, I tightened the strap of my name tag, Graham Anderson, Guest Services, and tried to convince myself that tonight would be just another night aboard the Aurelian Star, though deep inside, I knew that was a lie. Because there are shifts you clock into and shifts you survive, and this one already felt like the latter. The ship creaked around me like an old man whispering through his teeth, the sound settling into my bones as I grabbed my logbook and made my way to Deck 5, where guests had just finished their late dinners and the corridors had that eerie post-feast silence that comes after laughter has drained away, leaving only the faint smell of garlic butter and spilled wine lingering in the carpet. I'd been on the Aurelian Star for 6 months now, long enough to know the difference between ordinary ship noises, the groan of the hull, the whistle of wind through a half-shut balcony door, the thump of waves slapping steel, and the noises that don't belong, like the phantom footsteps that sometimes pace the promenade long after it's been cleared, or the echo of glasses clinking when the bar is empty, or worse, the hollow thud of knuckles rapping against a locked stateroom door when no one is assigned inside. My first duty that evening was routine, a couple in 7123 complaining about flickering lights. But when I stepped into the hallway leading there, the bulbs were steady, white and too bright, casting shadows in angles that made no sense, like they were bent by an invisible prism. And at the end of the corridor, I could swear I saw someone standing by the service door. Tall, shoulders slumped, face blurred by distance. But when I blinked, he was gone. And the only thing left was a damp trail of footprints, as though he had stepped up from the ocean itself. Trying to shake off the image, I logged the light complaint as resolved. But unease crawled up my spine like a line of ants, because the truth was that sightings like that were not rare here, though no one wanted to admit it officially, and rumors among crew members whispered that the Aurelian Star was built on the bones of an older vessel, one that had been scuttled after a failed quarantine back in the 1920s, its corridors sealed with stories the sea had claimed and refused to return. By midnight, I found myself at Guest Services sorting through the battered cardboard box we used for Lost and Found. And as I cataloged a cracked iPhone, a gold charm bracelet, and a disposable camera, I noticed someone had scrawled across the flaps in thick black marker, "Return what the sea owns." The words smudged with water stains that hadn't been there yesterday. And as I traced the letters with my finger, the phone on my desk rang, making me flinch hard enough to drop the bracelet. And when I answered, the line hissed as though the ocean itself had dialed in, a man's voice whispering my name, Graham, in the same exact tone my mother used to when I'd stumbled in past curfew, soft but edged with something I couldn't name. I spun in my chair, scanning the empty atrium beyond the desk, my pulse hammering, and that's when I saw them again. Wet footprints, glistening black under the lobby lights, leading away from my station toward the elevators, fading one by one as if the sea itself was walking through the ship and daring me to follow.
I tried to laugh it off at first, telling myself I'd been awake too long, that the footprints were a trick of my imagination mixed with the endless groaning of the hull, but the truth was that I couldn't ignore the call-ins piling on my radio, each one stranger than the last, and together they painted a picture that felt less like coincidence and more like a pattern written in salt and steel. The first came from a woman in stateroom 9229, her voice thin and shaking as she explained that her phone tracker showed the device moving with her across the ship, always a step behind, like a second heartbeat she couldn't shake. And though I told her I'd check Lost and Found in the morning, I already knew the cracked iPhone sitting in the box upstairs had pulsed once under my palm, vibrating against the cardboard like a living thing. Not half an hour later, Cabin 1107 reported hearing a man humming through the vents, low and steady like a broken music box. And the description chilled me further because it wasn't just humming, but the exact melody I'd heard once before, a tango record played on a gramophone that didn't exist anywhere on the ship. The same song that had drifted through my head ever since the lounge door had opened for me on a floor we didn't have. I went to investigate, walking the corridor alone with the vents above me, whispering like throats clearing in unison, and though I found nothing, the echo clung to me all the way back to the service lift. I told myself I was being paranoid until the next call came in from 1412, where a couple swore that a man was pressing his hands against their balcony glass, peering in with a stare so unyielding they had locked themselves in the bathroom, and when I went to their deck and leaned out with my flashlight, the beam hit the waves below. And that's when another beam, pale and weak as moonlight, moved with mine across the water, searching, scanning, as though someone down in the ocean carried a torch of their own. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the radio, and though I didn't report that part to the couple, I could feel their terror vibrating against my own, two strings tuned to the same dread. Later, while trying to gather myself in the pantry with a bitter cup of instant coffee, I checked the box again, though I didn't want to, and tucked between the bracelet and a stack of room keys was something that hadn't been there earlier. A folded missing person flyer, the edges still damp as though dredged from the sea, the face staring up at me unsettlingly familiar, a man in his 40s with long wet hair and a beard, his dark eyes printed in half-tone dots that somehow felt alive, and across the bottom in bold block letters was the name Antonio, circled 3 times in fresh red ink that bled faintly through to the other side. I froze, my stomach twisting, because I'd heard of him before. Murmured in crew gossip, an Italian passenger who'd supposedly drowned on a different voyage years ago. Those stories varied. Some said it was an accident, some whispered it was something else entirely, a bargain with the sea. But what struck me most was the date stamped at the bottom of the flyer, April 29, 2018. Exactly 2 years to the day as my mother had died, a cruel coincidence that made my throat close up. I shoved the paper back into the box and slammed the lid shut, telling myself it wasn't possible, that it was some leftover joke or a misfiled report. But as I turned away, the overhead light sputtered and went dark for 3 seconds, just long enough for me to hear the softest whisper behind me, "Graham, you owe me a drink." And when the light blinked back, the footprints were there again, fresh and wet, trailing away from the pantry toward the elevators, each one sinking slightly deeper, as though the sea itself was walking heavier now, more insistent, demanding that I follow into the parts of the ship that never appear on the blueprints, into decks that were never meant for the living.
By the time I worked up the courage to chase those footprints, the ship had gone eerily still. The kind of silence that doesn't feel like peace, but like the hush before something breathes against your ear. And as I followed the wet marks across the carpet, I realized they were leading me straight toward Elevator C, the one we all joked about in hushed tones, but never took after midnight because too many crew had sworn it open to places that didn't belong on the Aurelian Star. I stepped inside anyway, telling myself it was my duty, pressing the worn brass button for deck 12 even though the light didn't blink, and almost immediately the car lurched into motion with a strange smoothness, like it wasn't riding cables but drifting in water. And I felt my gut knot because the numbers above the door didn't change normally, but skipped, hesitated, then rolled past 10, 11, and instead of 12, it stopped at a blank panel marked only with a crooked 0. The doors parted with a groan and revealed a hallway I'd never seen in my 6 months aboard, narrow and wood-paneled, glowing under the weak light of 3 brass sconces that burned not with electricity, but with a flame-colored haze like the shine of old candles trapped behind glass. 4 doors lined the corridor, unlabeled, each identical except the second on the left, which seemed to lean out of alignment with the others, tilted just a breath too far as though it were listening. And the carpet beneath my shoes felt soft, spongy, almost alive, as if moss had grown thick beneath the fabric. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to press the lobby button and leave this place sealed, but my hand moved of its own accord, swiping my crew card against the second door, and though the reader didn't blink, the knob turned anyway, swinging open into a lounge that looked plucked straight from the 1920s. Velvet banquettes curving against the walls, tables polished to a gleam, and a gramophone resting on the bar, its horn like a golden flower opening toward me. 2 glasses sat abandoned on the counter, one smudged with a fresh lipstick ring, the other still beating condensation as though it had been poured moments ago. And in the wide wall mirror across from me, I saw myself standing there, pale and trembling, only something wasn't right. My reflection was shifted to the right, as though the mirror were making room for someone else, someone taller, waiting to appear. The air thickened with a briny smell, salt, and something metallic, and before I could breathe, the gramophone needle dropped onto the record without touching, releasing a warped tango that vibrated through my teeth and made the room feel tilted, like I'd stepped into the inside of a seashell. And then, a man materialized at the far corner, not through the door I'd entered, but by peeling himself from the shadows, tall and lanky with long damp hair that clung to his cheeks, linen shirt bright against the gloom, and his smile was that of a bartender who knew my order before I spoke. "Haven't we met?" he asked, his accent rolling Mediterranean vowels into something almost musical, and though my throat was dry, I managed to croak, Guests are not permitted here. This is a staff-only area," clinging to the thin shield of protocol, but he only chuckled, stepping closer with an easy grace, saying, "I'm not a guest, I'm a passenger," before reaching behind the bar and with practiced ease, pouring 2 martinis, raising one to me with a sad, knowing look that made the room colder. I didn't take it, and when he saw my hesitation, he laughed again, soft but sharp, setting my glass down on the counter with the lipstick ring, as though insisting it already belonged to me, then touched the gramophone with a fingertip, muting the tango to a hum. "The ship takes things," he said matter-of-factly, his voice low but filling every corner. "Phones, bracelets, names, stories. It keeps them in that box of yours until it learns them by heart, and then it calls them back." And my pulse surged as I thought of the cardboard box upstairs, of the flyer with his face, of the words scrawled in marker, "Return what the sea owns." "Who are you?" I whispered, though the missing poster still burned in my memory, and he tilted his head with an almost sympathetic smile, saying, "The wrong question," before lifting his gaze to the mirror, and I followed it in horror to see that in the reflection, my uniform was drenched, water dripping steadily from the fabric, and worse, the name on my badge wasn't Graham anymore. It was Sebastian, the letters gleaming faintly as though etched into the glass, and for the first time I felt the ship not as steel and engine, but as something alive, listening, rehearsing my name with lips it had borrowed, deciding whether I was meant to stay among the living crew or join the passengers it had already claimed. I wanted to run, to slam the door and ride the elevator back to a numbered deck where things still obeyed the laws of steel and gravity. But my legs rooted themselves to the carpet, as if the ship had already claimed me, and when the passenger I realized, because he was less a person than a mask the ship wore, stepped closer, I could smell brine rolling off him like mist rising from rocks, sharp and wet, mixed with the faint sweetness of rotting lilies. And his eyes, green-gray like sea glass, held mine with a weight that made it hard to breathe. "You owe me a drink," he repeated, sliding the untouched martini toward me with fingers that trembled not with weakness, but with restraint, as though he was holding back the whole ocean inside his hand. And I shook my head, mumbling something about being on duty, about guests, about rules, clinging to protocol as though it could anchor me. But he only smiled, as if rules were the punchline of a joke. Behind him, the gramophone whined, the tango speeding up until it skipped in grotesque loops. And then the mirror rippled again, showing me not as I was, but as I might become. Hair slicked back in 1920s style, face leaner, eyes hollow. The bartender of this ghost lounge serving glass after glass to passengers who were no longer alive, their laughter echoing like clinking chains. "Do you know why the ship keeps these?" the passenger asked, gesturing to the drinks, the lipstick glass, the abandoned tables. "Because stories have to be remembered, or the sea swallows them whole, and the Aurelian Star was built on too many stories already. It needs someone to keep them pouring, someone to tell them over and over until they can rest." And I felt the air shift colder, the sconces dimming, shadows lengthening like they were leaning closer to eavesdrop. I backed away toward the door, but the knob melted into the wall, smooth as if it had never existed, trapping me inside with him. And panic throbbed at the base of my skull, a dizzying pressure that made me clutch the edge of the bar. "You're not Antonio," I rasped, desperate to ground myself. "And you're not Sebastian either, you're—" But the passenger cut me off with a raised hand, smile gone now, his expression grave, voice lowering to a whisper that carried through every glass and mirror in the room. "I am what they leave behind. I am the ledger of the drowned. I am the sea keeping its accounts. And you, Graham Anderson, are already written in." And when he said my name, it was like my mother's voice, soft and scolding, the way she used to call me home from the fields at dusk, except laced with something older, something patient and eternal. I lunged toward the gramophone, thinking if I stopped the record, the spell would break. But before I could touch it, the music cut off by itself, plunging the room into silence so heavy it pressed against my ears until they popped. And in that silence, I heard faint weeping, dozens of voices, layered,
Passengers, crew, men, women, even children, all crying at once in muffled harmony. And it was coming not from the room, but from the mirror, where their faces crowded behind my reflection like fish pressed against aquarium glass, mouths open, eyes wide, hands clawing against the barrier as if begging to be let out. The passenger leaned against the bar as though he had all the time in the world, watching me tremble, his voice calm, almost tender.
You think you work this ship, but it works you. You walk its halls and log its complaints, but it logs yours, every secret, every regret, every name you've tried to forget. The sea doesn't let anything slip. It only waits for the right moment to collect. And I thought of the lost and found box, of the flyer, of the photographs of me that had no camera to take them, and my chest tightened as I realized I was already being cataloged like the rest, a story the ship was filing away for later. The mirror bulged suddenly, the surface ballooning outward like a waterbed, and one pale hand burst through, dripping black water, fingers reaching for me with frantic urgency. And without thinking, I slapped the hand away, feeling its cold slickness coat my palm, but the gesture sent ripples across the surface, and more hands began pushing through, clawing, each one belonging to a face I could almost recognize. Guests who had vanished mid-voyage, names whispered among crew but never logged officially. Stories of people who went to sleep in their cabins and never woke up. The passenger didn't move to stop them, didn't even flinch, just raised his martini and drank, watching me struggle as though this was the initiation, the test, to see if I would resist or surrender. And when I screamed for them to stop, the chorus of weeping cut off instantly, the hands retreating, the mirror smoothing back to glass as if nothing had happened, leaving me shaking and drenched in sweat, clutching the bar like a lifeline. The passenger set his empty glass down and smiled again, softer this time, almost pitying, and he whispered, "The ship has chosen you to keep the stories, Graham, because you already know the rules. Don't drink what you didn't pour. Don't answer when the dead call your name. Don't take the elevator when it offers you a floor that doesn't exist. But most importantly, always return what the sea owns." And as he said it, the lounge dissolved around us like paper burning, the velvet banquettes curling into smoke, the sconces guttering out one by one, and I was left standing alone in the bare elevator, drenched and trembling, clutching nothing but the echo of his words as the door slid shut and the car began its slow, impossible descent to somewhere far below the waterline where numbers don't go.
When the elevator finally groaned open again, I staggered out onto deck 5, but everything was wrong. The atrium lights flickered in a rolling wave, one after the other, like someone invisible was pacing toward me, and every step of that unseen march made the walls shudder with a pulse I felt in my teeth, as though the ship itself had developed a heartbeat. The radio on my belt crackled with overlapping voices, fragments of passenger reports stacking one after another, a man staring through balcony glass at 1412, a rhythmic knocking from inside the sealed porthole of 615, a husband in 1003 who had gone to bed middle-aged and risen at dawn years younger, with a smile that terrified his wife into tears. And as I spun in circles trying to decide which emergency to answer first, the ceiling clock above guest services jumped back 5 minutes before leaping 7 ahead, metal hands twitching like a nervous eyelid, while the CCTV feeds in the control room began stuttering, showing me one moment walking the atrium, then a static-laced copy of me frozen mid-step, then a blur where I should have been. My stomach knotted tighter when I scrubbed back the footage from Elevator C. The moment the doors opened, the monitor showed nothing but the dark throat of a shaft, me apparently staring into emptiness. And then when the doors closed, the screen flicked back, registering the car descending smoothly. Only this time, its path dipped beneath the lowest mapped deck, ticking past 0 to -1, -2, and further down into blackness before snapping back like the system had corrected itself. "Generator load spike," Enzo's voice drawled through the radio, trying for calm but sounding like he'd smoked a whole pack in one drag. "Stable for now, but something's drawing, like a current pulling downward, like a tide deciding what it wanted to keep." Then, as if on cue, the battered cardboard box of Lost and Found on my desk shuddered and thunked once, hard enough to slide an inch, and I froze, watching the flaps bulge outward like something inside was breathing, until at last it split itself open, spilling its contents across the counter, phones, jewelry, forgotten trinkets, and in the middle of it all, a stack of envelopes I hadn't seen before, each one unmarked except for the slick saltwater stains soaking the edges.
And when I tore the first one open, my chest hollowed out, because inside was a photograph of me, candid and impossible, walking the aft stairs, scanning a balcony latch, standing at the promenade rail, all angles where there were no cameras, as though someone had been following me with eyes that didn't need lenses. Envelope after envelope revealed more of the same, each image capturing me in private moments, scratching my head in the staff pantry, leaning against the stairwell, even staring blankly at my own reflection in the mirror of my cabin, a photo that shouldn't exist unless I had taken it myself. But the final envelope didn't hold me at all. It held a warped image of the lounge mirror, surface bent and twisted like rippling water. And in it, I lay slumped on a velvet banquette, my mouth stuffed with a towel, wrists bound by something slick and dark. And though the face was mine, the eyes weren't. They were dull, vacant, drained of everything but reflection. I dropped the photo like it burned, my breath ragged, and the radio on my belt spat out my name again, Graham, in a voice not Enzo's, not any crew members, but the passengers, smooth and commanding, as though the ship itself had learned how to pronounce me perfectly. And then the power dipped hard, lights guttering out for a long, nauseating heartbeat before buzzing back, revealing new wet footprints leading away from the desk, each one deeper than the last, pressing into the carpet with the weight of a tide heavier than steel, dragging me toward a choice I didn't want to make. Follow where the sea wanted me to go, or stand still and wait for it to take me anyway.
I've always believed in writing things down when panic starts to close its fist around my throat, and that night, with the smell of brine seeping from the box and the radio whispering my name like it had grown a mouth of its own, I yanked a blank guest comment card from the desk and began scribbling out rules in frantic block letters, as though language itself could shield me from whatever current was pulling me under. Rule 1, don't drink what you didn't pour. Rule 2, if you hear your name the way a parent would say it, don't answer. Rule 3, never take an elevator to a floor you don't recognize. Rule 4, mirrors are doors. Rule 5, the ship barters in stories, don't pay in full. I was halfway through scrawling a sixth when a shadow moved across the atrium floor, slow and deliberate, the kind of movement that doesn't belong to any passenger because passengers hurry or stumble or sway. But this shadow slid, like it had all the time in the world. I held my pen tighter, sweat dripping onto the card, and then she appeared, a woman with tired, strong gray eyes, shoulders bowed under invisible weight, clutching a folded photograph in her hand like it was the last anchor, tethering her to reality. She introduced herself softly, her accent Italian laced with grief, and when she unfolded the picture, my stomach clenched because I knew the face instantly. The long-haired man with the wet beard, the one I'd seen in the missing person flyer, the one I'd glimpsed in mirrors and corridors, the one who had poured me a martini in a lounge that shouldn't exist. His name is Antonio, she whispered, her voice catching. I saw him years ago in Santorini and again tonight here on this ship. He died the same month my husband did, and the desperation in her gaze was like a mirror itself, reflecting every secret fear I had been bottling since my first shift aboard. And though I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that ghosts didn't walk steel decks, my silence betrayed me, and I gave her a look I couldn't take back, one that told her I knew she wasn't mad, that she wasn't the only one haunted. I mumbled something official, a useless promise about checking manifests, and she nodded, leaving me with the photograph burned into my vision, a circle drawn around Antonio's name in thick, desperate red. After she disappeared into the dark of the corridor, I dug through Enza's drawer of old voyage records, brittle papers that smelled like rust and mildew, ship logs so ancient that they still referred to the Aurelian Star by its previous name, the one it bore before the refit and the silence around its quarantine, and buried in the crew roster from 1923, my eyes snagged on a name that made my blood turn ice. Anderson, G, spelled with a double S but close enough to make my pulse hammer, and for a moment I saw myself not as a man in uniform, but as an entry in a ledger, a body logged, a story filed away. I tried to laugh it off, tell myself it was a coincidence, a misprint, but my hand shook too badly to even close the drawer, and that's when the radio broke in again, softer this time, whispering, Graham to Deck 0, and I froze because Deck 0 doesn't exist, not on any plan, not in any blueprint, not in any drill, but the way the voice said it left no room for argument, as if the ship itself had turned into a parent calling its child home. And the comment card under my pen bled ink across the paper, writing the sixth rule without my help. Answer only when called by the living. The words glistened wet, as if the sea itself had leaned over my shoulder and written them in salt water, and in that moment, as the atrium lights flickered and the photographs of me curled in the damp air, I understood with gut-deep certainty that my choices were narrowing, that the Aurelian Star wasn't content with haunting passengers anymore. It had picked me out of the crowd, weighed my regrets and my silences, and now it wanted me to descend to the deck that didn't exist, to a place where rules didn't matter, where the ship kept the names it wasn't ready to release. And though every sane part of me screamed to stay at my post, to cling to the safety of routine, my
feet were already turning toward the service stairwell, following the echo of a summons no one living should ever obey.
The stairwell down to Deck 0 was colder than the rest of the ship, colder even than the outside air that whipped across the promenade at night. And with each step I took below the last mapped floor, the metals seemed to sweat, condensation slicking the rails until my hands slipped if I didn't grip tight, the air thickening with salt so raw it burned the back of my throat. The walls carried marks that shouldn't have been there, layers of graffiti carved deep into paint that had been repainted 100 times over. Crew warnings, desperate scratches that read things like, "Don't listen, muster in silence," and "We are still here," each one gouged into the steel as if the writers had known the paint would be rolled over again and again. But the ship itself had refused to forget their words. By the time I reached the landing marked with no number, my chest heaved and my ears rang with pressure, like the ocean itself was leaning against the bulkhead, listening and waiting. A door loomed at the bottom, riveted and massive, with a porthole set too high for any normal eye. But as I drew close, it clouded white, like someone was breathing on the other side, and then a child's hand pressed against the glass, pale and slick, fingers spreading as though reaching for mine. And when I staggered back, another hand appeared beside it, larger, and then another, until a crowd of palms fogged the porthole like the imprint of an entire congregation. The door gave way with a sigh, not a creak, as though it had been waiting for me specifically, and I stepped into a space that could never fit inside a ship's belly. A chapel made of welded hull and stained bulkheads, pews cobbled together from deck planks, a lectern fashioned from a snapped oar, and along every wall, mirrors were bolted crookedly, each reflecting not the same congregation, but different ones from different decades. A man in a salt-stiff sweater seated beside a woman in a cocktail dress, a child in patched clothes holding hands with a sailor. Every face waterlogged but patient, every gaze locked on me. I froze halfway down the aisle, heart battering my ribs, because though the chapel was filled, the silence was total. No cough, no shuffle, no breath. Just the low hum of the sea pressing from every direction. And when I dared glance at one of the mirrors, I saw myself at the lectern, older, thinner, uniform dark with seawater, speaking words I didn't recognize to a crowd that leaned forward hungrily, like they needed my voice to breathe. A gramophone in the corner turned on by itself, its warped tango filling the chapel, but no one moved to dance. Their heads only tilted in unison, necks creaking like old wood. And then he appeared, the passenger, descending from behind the lectern with the calm grace of someone who knew this was his stage. His form a composite of 1,000 drowned faces, shifting slightly every time I blinked, but always with those green-gray eyes that pinned me in place. He smiled as though this was a reunion, spreading his hands like a priest welcoming his flock, and said, in a voice that rang through the chapel without raising a note, "You understand now why you've been called, Graham. You've heard their stories in the footsteps, in the photographs, in the lost things the sea returns. But stories left unfinished rot like nets tangled in coral, and the shit can't rest until someone gives them shape." And his words struck deep, because I realized he wasn't trying to kill me, at least not outright. He wanted me to work, to serve, to be the mouthpiece through which the ship kept its accounts. And when he stepped closer, his shadow stretched across the pews until it touched every bowed head, his grin fading into a look that was almost sorrowful, and he whispered, "We need you to ring the bell, to muster the names, to tell it right, because the sea always takes, but someone must speak for what it's taken." I glanced at the lectern and saw resting there a small brass bell, polished though everything else rusted. And when I looked back at the mirrors, my reflection was already standing behind it, hand poised to ring, eyes hollow but ready. Terror clenched my gut, but so did something else, more dangerous: recognition. Because hadn't I already been cataloging the ship's ghosts in my mind, scribbling rules on cards, keeping order among chaos, telling myself it was my job to log complaints and resolve them? This was the same thing, only stripped bare of pretense, not customer service, but ghost service, not logbooks, but eulogies. The congregation waited,
their silence a weight pressing on my chest until I could barely inhale, and the passenger tilted his head expectantly, lips curving around my name like a promise. Graham. My hand trembled, reaching toward the bell, every instinct screaming to flee, to fight, to deny this role, but my fingers brushed the metal and it was warm, pulsing faintly like a living thing. And when I finally lifted it, the mirrors rippled with relief, faces leaning closer, mouths opening wide without sound, and I knew that the first ring would not just summon them, it would bind me, chaining me to this deck that doesn't exist, to a duty no contract could ever free me from. But the longer I hesitated, the heavier the silence pressed, until at last, unable to bear the weight of so many eyes, I raised the bell and let it fall.
The sound of that bell didn't just ring, it sank, plunging through the steel decks like a stone into black water, and the moment its echo faded, the congregation inhaled as one, the air around me shuddering like lungs finally filling after years of drowning, their eyes no longer vacant but luminous, glinting like phosphorescence in midnight surf. And the passenger smiled with something close to satisfaction, his voice curling through the chapel as he said, "You see? The sea remembers, but it cannot speak. It needs a witness, a keeper of names." And I realized that each toll of the bell was less about summoning ghosts than about pulling them back into focus, forcing the forgotten to be seen again, to be logged in some cruel ledger the ship insisted on keeping. The mirrors along the walls rippled violently now, each one flashing with scenes from voyages across a century, families boarding under banners, soldiers crammed in bunks, children staring through portholes at endless horizons, until the glass fractured with soft cracks that sounded like knuckles rapping on doors, and through those fissures, the dead pressed forward, their faces half seen, mouths open as if begging me to give them back their stories, and the weight of it made me stagger, clutching the lectern, because it wasn't just their grief pressing on me, it was their desperation, their unfinished sentences, their silent accusations. The passenger leaned close, his green-gray eyes endless and merciless, whispering, "You think you can escape after one ring? You are part of the roll now. You will keep ringing until the muster is complete." And when I tried to shake my head to deny him, the congregation all turned in unison, their necks creaking like wet rope, staring at me with expectation so crushing it felt like being buried alive. I wanted to scream that I wasn't their priest, that I wasn't their historian, that I was just a tired crewman trying to earn a paycheck, but the truth stuck in my throat because I knew deep down that I had already been serving them from the start, logging their complaints, cataloging their lost trinkets, listening to their whispers on the radio. And now the ship had simply stripped away the illusion, showing me the real nature of my job. When I looked back down at the lectern, the brass bell had multiplied, dozens of smaller bells appearing, each etched with names I couldn't quite read, and my reflection in the nearest mirror was no longer older and drowned, but hollow-eyed, ringing each one methodically, lips moving with words that didn't belong to me, but that still poured from my mouth like they had been waiting there all along. I turned to the passenger in panic, demanding, "What happens when the last bell is rung?" And for the first time his smile faltered, replaced by something more ambiguous, his face flickering between Antonio, Sebastian, and strangers I'd never seen, until at last he said, "Then the ship sleeps until someone else wakes it." And the way he said it made my blood run colder, because it wasn't a promise of peace, it was a cycle and inevitability, a trap that no single witness could ever end. The congregation began to hum low again, that warped tango, but this time layered with hundreds of voices, creating a drone so deep it shook the mirrors loose from their bolts, glass falling to the floor and shattering, only to reform instantly into new panes, showing different decades, different victims, and I realized the ship wasn't bound by time any more than it was bound by steel. It existed in every voyage at once, a loop of stories overlapping until they needed someone to sort them, to speak them, to toll them into sequence. And now that someone was me, I dropped the bell, but it didn't fall. It hung suspended in the air like the laws of gravity were suggestions here, chiming once more on its own, and the passenger's voice overlapped with a dozen others whispering, "Tell it right, Graham, tell it right," until I clapped my hands over my ears and stumbled back, only to feel the pews against my spine, every head turning toward me again,
patient but insistent, like students waiting for their teacher to continue a lesson, and I knew with gut-chilling certainty that whether I spoke or not, whether I rang the bell or smashed it to pieces, the ship would go on haunting, because it wasn't simply a place, it was a mouth, and it had chosen me as its tongue.
I don't remember deciding to speak, but the words came anyway, spilling from my throat like seawater. And as I clutched the lectern, my voice grew louder, steadier, until I realized I was reciting names I had never heard, yet each syllable rolled off my tongue with perfect clarity, as if the ship itself was feeding them through me. Sailors from 1923, children from 1954, honeymooners from 1979, every lost soul who had vanished without explanation on the Aurelian Star and the vessels that had worn its bones before. And with each name, the congregation leaned forward hungrily, their lips parting in silent gratitude, their faces softening as if the very act of remembrance gave them momentary peace. But the more names I spoke, the heavier the air became, until it felt like every breath I took was borrowed, as though I was inhaling the ghosts themselves. And I realized with terror that the ship wasn't only using me to remember. It was trying to hollow me out, to make me the permanent vessel of its ledger, its living archive, so it would never again have to risk forgetting. What happens if I stop? I croaked between names, and the passenger, standing beside me now like a patient confessor, tilted his head and whispered, "Then the ship resumes its collection." Doors knocked on in the night, phones gone missing, faces seen where no face should be, until someone else is brave enough, or foolish enough, to toll the roll again. And though I wanted to deny him, to refuse, I thought of Shelby's haunted eyes, of the passengers trembling in their cabins, of photos of myself taken from impossible angles, and I knew that if I didn't continue, the ship would simply turn its hunger back on them, on the living, gnawing away at sanity until it had the stories it craved. So I rang the bell again, the sound reverberating through the warped chapel, until it felt like the walls themselves were bowing, and the mirrors rippled with the violent visions. People I'd never met drowning in their cabins, corridors filling with seawater, families banging on locked doors, their screams bubbling into silence. And yet through all the horror, I kept calling the names, one by one, the bell chiming after each, a grim roll call that seemed endless. Until at last my voice faltered and the passenger laid a hand on my shoulder, his touch cold but oddly gentle, and said, "Enough for tonight. Let them rest, let yourself rest, because there will be more tomorrow, and the next day, and the next." And the congregation sagged back into their seats, their faces blurring again into the featureless patience of those who can wait forever. And the chapel dimmed as though someone had turned down a switch, leaving only the faint glow of the brass bell on the lectern pulsing like a heartbeat. I stumbled away from it, desperate to escape, and when I turned to the door, I found it open, the stairwell beyond leading back up toward the living decks. But before I crossed the threshold, I looked back once, compelled by something I couldn't name, and in the mirror nearest the lectern, I didn't see myself leaving. I saw myself staying, dressed in a bartender's white shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, shaking cocktails for a crowd of the drowned who raised their glasses in eternal silence. I slammed the door and fled, my breath ragged, my hands slick with sweat. And when I burst back into the mapped corridors of the ship, the lights seemed too bright, the air too thin, and for a moment I wondered if I had dreamed the entire descent, until I glanced down and saw the comment card still crumpled in my fist, the 6th rule bleeding across it in ink that hadn't dried. Answer only when called by the living. And I knew then that I hadn't escaped at all. I'd only agreed to a contract I hadn't signed, one that would follow me until the last bell tolled.
I still work aboard the Aurelian Star, still wear the same uniform, still smile at guests who ask where the buffet is or complain about flickering lights. But every night, when the ship settles into its long, heavy breathing and the sea presses close against the hull, I feel the pull toward the stairwell that isn't on any map, hear the faint chime of the brass bell echoing like a heartbeat below the decks, reminding me that my real shift doesn't end with paperwork in customer service logs, but with the roll call of the forgotten. I try to live normally, or at least the illusion of it. I drink burnt coffee in the pantry. I laugh with Enzo when he lights his 5th cigarette before sunrise. I nod politely to Shelby when she boards again and leaves her quiet flowers on the rail. But deep inside, I know I'm not the same man who first clocked in 6 months ago, because I carry the ship's ledger inside me now, the names bubbling up in my dreams, spilling from my lips in the shower, whispering themselves into the hum of the ventilation ducts. And no matter how hard I try to ignore them, the rules I wrote on that crumpled card burn brighter in my mind than any safety drill or training manual. Don't drink what you didn't pour. Don't answer when the dead call your name. Never take an elevator to a floor you don't recognize. Mirrors are doors. The ship barters in stories. Don't pay in full. Return what the sea owns. Answer only when called by the living. These rules are the only thing that keep me tethered, the only boundaries I can enforce against a vessel that has none. And yet I know even they aren't enough, because every night I end up standing at the lectern again, ringing the bell, watching faces blur from agony into brief relief, only to reset by the next toll. Sometimes between rings, I catch glimpses in the mirrors of a version of me who gave in completely, sleeves rolled to the elbow, mixing drinks in that ghost lounge for passengers who never disembark. And I wonder if that's not my future but my present, if I'm already serving them without realizing it, if the Graham Anderson greeting guests in the atrium is just another reflection the ship projects to keep the cycle turning. What terrifies me most is not the dead, not the passenger, not even the endless muster. It's the realization that I've started to care for them. That part of me feels relief when I told the names and see their faces soften, as if I'm fulfilling some ancient duty. And I don't know if that's the ship reshaping me, or if I was always susceptible to it, always a man looking for order and chaos, always ready to trade my own voice for the illusion of control. Sometimes when the moon hangs low and the sea glitters black as oil, I hear my name whispered from the promenade, said in a tone of fondness I haven't heard since my mother was alive. And though every rule screams not to answer, some nights my lips part anyway, caught on the edge of betrayal. And I fear the day I respond fully, because I know the moment I do, the ship will claim me outright, ringing its bell with my own mouth, adding my name to the endless roll. Until then, I keep my post, I file my reports, I nod at passengers and tell them everything is fine. But when the ship breathes, I breathe with it. And when the bell tolls, I toll with it. And the truth that gnaws at me every night is that I no longer know where Graham Anderson ends and where the Aurelian Star begins. Because some contracts don't require ink or signatures, they just need you to listen long enough. And once you do, you're part of the story forever. That was Graham Anderson's story, and his warning. The Aurelian Star sails on, carrying its lost passengers, its cursed rules, and its endless roll call of the drowned. If you ever find yourself on a cruise ship and hear your name whispered from the dark, remember the rules and pray you're strong enough not to answer. If you enjoyed tonight's tale, make sure to subscribe to Echoes After Midnight for more terrifying stories every week. Click the bell so you never miss what comes after midnight.